Welcome to the Nature Photo Guys podcast,
where we talk about nature photography, from gear to our philosophies and everything in between.
So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax.
You're listening to Joe Desjardins
and Chris Gibbs, the Nature Photo Guys.
Hey Chris, how's it going?
Good, how you doing, Joe?
Not too bad, not too bad. I hope you had a good couple of weeks there.
I did, and you as well?
Yeah, it's been hot. It's been really freaking hot. And I'm not a heat kind of guy, so I've been pretty much hibernating. So
is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I prefer 21 degrees would be perfect for me all the time. Yeah,
well, I was outdoors today and it reached 32 down in Lethbridge.
Oh man, really?
It was a cooker.
Oh,
so
that's too hot.
Glad to be inside making a podcast.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely.
So what are we up to this week?
Yeah, well, I guess before we get going on our topic today, I think it's good that, this is the fourth episode. And I think it's good to give a shout out to everybody. We've had lots of listeners. We've had lots of comments, questions, and, we've been feeling the love, Joe. So already we're getting, we're inspiring people to pull out their cameras and whatnot. So it's kind of nice. It's kind of what we wanted, right?
Yeah, exactly. Nice to see some comments below, on Instagram. Got quite a bit of views on our YouTube channel already. Mm-hmm. Emails sent in with questions. It's just been great. I'm really happy with how things are going for our first 3 episodes. Absolutely.
And you know what? The more people listen and, hey, make sure you go on and subscribe to our podcast, everybody. Give us a big rating. That'd be great. It just helps us continue these podcasts going forward. And,
don't forget, we have a YouTube channel now too.
We do.
Yeah, that's right. So the Nature Photo Guys podcast, YouTube channel. So, we're going to be recording live video, from episode 3 on.
That's right.
So, so every 2 weeks on the Tuesday, you'll see us up there on YouTube.
So make sure you hit the big red subscribe button. That'd be great. And give us a thumbs up on all our videos. That'd be awesome. So again, the more you guys do that and the more comments and questions, bring them on. We'd love to hear it. Just gives us topics and keep going further.
Yeah, you betcha. So what are we going to talk about this week?
The one thing that keeps coming up is the fact that what is the best way to get off auto mode, aperture priority mode, right? Is that the easiest way to go from auto for the beginner?
I think so. Cause you can pretty much do it all in aperture, right? Yeah. I mean, when you think about creating a photo, right? Making a photo, one of the first things I think about is depth of field. Right. What's going to be in focus and what's going to be out of focus. And you can control that with aperture, right?
Correct.
So shooting an aperture priority gives me that option before I set anything else, right? So I think, going from auto or program mode, and starting in aperture priority is totally going to change the way your photography looks.
So in aperture priority mode, what is really happening here? So it's basically you're able to adjust the aperture, correct?
Yeah. So the aperture, for those that don't know what it is, it's the opening in the lens itself. It's not on the camera body, but it's in the lens. And it's made up of aperture blades, right? And when you adjust the aperture, okay, so for example, when you adjust the aperture from let's say 2.8, which is a very wide or open aperture, okay, the aperture blades are wide open, so it allows a lot of light in. And then you can stop it down or close the aperture. Depending on the lens, you can go down to anywhere from f22 to say 32, right? Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So in this case here, it's kind of opposite of what people would think. The smaller number, the bigger the opening, right?
Isn't that funny? That's one thing when I was learning photography that stumped me for the longest time. Wide open, you think should be f22 or f32, but
that's right.
It's not, right?
So, and then f32 being the smallest opening, right? Yeah. So that's what aperture is. It's controlling the amount of light coming into the camera via the lens itself.
Right. And that also decides your depth of field in actual fact as well, I guess, right? So if you're on f/2
right.
versus f2.8, that's a big difference.
Correct. So if we're going to shoot wide open, like say f2.8, f4, 5.6, so the larger the opening, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. And if you look at, I would say the majority of the wildlife photographers out there, including myself and yourself, we tend to shoot wide open or at a large aperture to create those soft backgrounds, right?
Right.
So, at f4, let's say I'm shooting, or my on my Lumix, my Leica 200 2.8. If I'm shooting at 2.8 and I'm focused on the subject, well, my subject's going to be in tack sharp focus, but the background's going to be soft.
Right. Just like we talked about last episode, it also depends on how far your subject is away from a tree or something in the background.
That's right, to the background. And I was actually just going to say that too. So subject to background distance. Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah. So right off the bat, just knowing that little trick of going into aperture priority, setting your aperture to say f4 or 5.6, because realistically we're talking about longer telephoto lenses, right?
We are, yes. Well, wildlife photography kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So realistically, you're probably going to be shooting at either f4 or 5.6, right? So let's use 5.6 as the example here.
Okay.
You're going to set it to 5.6, and that's going to allow you to get that shallow depth of field.
Sure.
Right?
So, and some of the lenses, like the 100 to 400, have like a variable, aperture, right? So it's basically goes from f4 to f5.6 or something like that.
That's right.
As you hit the 400,
when you're zoomed
right?
out, that's right. So for the majority of the time, you're going to be at 400 anyway, so it'll be stuck at 5.6.
Sure.
Right.
Fair enough.
So again, that's aperture, right? And then so once you set it into aperture priority, okay. Well, here, let me rephrase this. So at f5.6, you're wide open.
Yep.
Okay. So shallow depth of field. Now, if you start to stop down or close the aperture down to say f16, f22, that sort of thing, then you're going to get more depth of field. You're going to see, the entire animal may be in focus, including some of the background. Again, depending on how far the subject is to the background, right?
Sure. Yep.
But this is where you have to differentiate with aperture depending on the type of nature photography you're doing.
Sure.
So we're talking wildlife photography right now.
Right.
Usually shoot wide open. If we're talking landscape photography, this is where you may go down to f16, f22, because traditionally with landscape photography, you want everything in focus.
Yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely. Front to back, right?
Exactly. Pretty much from tippy toes out to infinity.
Exactly.
And so, but with wildlife, it's the opposite. So you can see how aperture works for both genres, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So wildlife, boom, 5.6. Landscape, f16, f22, depending on where you're going to focus, et cetera, right?
Okay.
So you're on the extremes of your lens.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're doing the we'll say, as you call it, the trophy shot, the bear's head,
that's
right, versus an environmental shot, the bear is walking with cubs or something with trees in the background.
Exactly.
You're going to adjust your aperture differently for those shots.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
you're going to deal with the environmental shot more as a landscape shot. Would that be what you would do?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Because you'll be amazed at how shallow the depth of field is. Say on like on this like at this 200 2.8.
Right.
Wide open, you've got millimeters, of depth of field. Like it's a sliver of focus.
So the eyes are in focus and the nose is not, kind of thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
The eyes are in focus, and I'm okay with tack sharp eyes and the ears are slightly soft. Maybe the tip of the nose slightly soft if the animal's looking right at you.
Yeah.
But you have to really nail the exposure, the focus, right?
Sure.
On the eyes. But like you're suggesting with the environmental shots, never are the animals walking in a straight line parallel to your your camera sensor, right? That's where you start to stop down f8, f11, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
If the light allows you to do it, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So that's kind of just a quick little thing on aperture priority. Now, once you set your aperture, you have to consider two other things.
Okay.
And the next is your ISO. Okay.
Yep.
So the sensitivity of light to the sensor, essentially what your film speed back in the day when we
Right.
shot film, right? Okay.
Exactly.
And so, a good general starting point for me is anywhere between 400 and 800 ISO.
Okay.
So if I'm shooting at 5.6, set my ISO to 400, say 400 ISO, then I'm usually going to get some, like under normal lighting conditions, right? You're going to be at a pretty decent shutter speed where the majority of the time you're going to be able to stop the action. Like,
Okay.
and I don't mean fast action, but I mean, an animal walking or something like
Yes.
that,
Not
or
running full
lifting.
blast.
That's
Yeah,
right. But lifting
exactly.
its head, chewing, that kind of stuff, right?
Okay.
Maybe 1/60th, 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second, something like that, right? Depending on light.
Sure. Yeah.
Now that's just general all day shooting, but of course, the best times to photograph wildlife are early morning, late
Yeah.
evenings.
Of course.
So you're probably going to have to bump up your ISO to say like 800 or 1600, maybe even 3200,
Okay.
to get a fast enough shutter speed to prevent a blurry image,
Okay.
because that's the third part of the equation, or as we call the exposure triangle.
That's right.
So we set the aperture at 5.6, we set the ISO to say 400, and then we let the camera choose the shutter speed, right, based on the amount of light. That's it. I mean,
Okay.
as simple as it sounds, it is, but it isn't. I mean, you still have to. You can't just set it and shoot,
Right.
and just you still have to pay attention to what the camera is doing, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've had my ISO set to say like 400.
Yeah.
I should have been at 1600.
Oh.
Didn't pay attention. I go to take the photo and you hear click, click, and it's like, oh, you know what I mean? Because I
Yeah.
wasn't paying attention to the light,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
I had a wide open aperture, so I had the most amount of light that can come through.
Right.
So I couldn't allow more light to come in, but I forgot to bump up my ISO to give me a faster shutter speed.
So
right?
what you're saying, but yeah, what you're saying is exactly that. The shutter speed ended up being, I don't know, a second or something instead of 1/60th or something like that.
That's right. Like a lot of times, it'll drop down to a 15th or a 30th of a second, which is usually too slow sometimes, especially
Sure.
if the animal's moving.
Right.
And you get that click, click thing. And I'm just like, right away, I know what I did. So
Yeah.
it's just a matter of, changing the ISO very quickly, and
Sure.
you're off to the races again. But it's not a just set it and forget it,
Right.
right? You
You're
have to pay
constantly
attention.
playing around with
You're
it, right?
constantly looking at the at the settings, making sure that your shutter speed doesn't drop to
Okay.
below a certain number, right?
Sure.
So,
Yeah. One thing you mentioned there was you're adjusting the ISO. So I guess on some cameras, we should let everybody know that when you go into aperture priority mode, in some or in most cameras, I guess, unless you change it yourself, the ISO is probably in auto and the shutter speed is in auto, right? You're going to actually have to go in and adjust the ISO yourself. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So yeah, you want to get out of auto ISO for sure. It's you're trying to take control of the camera, right?
Yeah.
You're making the picture, right? Okay. So you don't want it in auto ISO and it's all over the place, because now it's going to be based on what the camera decides on with the shutter and the ISO, right? So essentially what you want to do is you want to determine 2 out of the 3 factors, right? So you're going to put it in aperture, you're going to put it on the ISO you want, and then you let the camera take care of the shutter speed. So yes, definitely not auto ISO.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you notice the shutter speed is sitting at 1/15th or whatever, and it's getting dark and you need a faster shutter speed, bump the ISO up, basically is what you're saying.
That's right. Because if you think about it, when you're increasing the ISO, you're increasing the sensitivity of the light,
right?
Yep. Like the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So it's allowing more light, I guess for lack of a better word, to be absorbed into the sensor, right? So if there's more light coming in, then you're going to need a faster shutter speed to balance the exposure, right?
Yep.
So Honestly, guys, it's just something to play around with, right? Like if you're new to aperture priority, go out and just play with it, experiment, and see what we're actually talking about,
In
right?
all different types of light too, right? Not,
That's right. That's right.
3 o'clock in the afternoon, bright sunny day is going to be a lot different for you than a sunrise or sunset scenario during golden hour, right? So,
well, that's right.
yeah.
You're going to have to. So in there's a really good example. 3 in the afternoon, you're photographing wildlife. Maybe it's going in and out of the clouds, whatever it is,
Yeah.
but you're on an opportunity where it's just phenomenal, and it's just like it doesn't matter what the light is, because we're trying to shoot in the prime time, but for some reason you've got a bear on a carcass doing whatever, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so there are times where you have to adjust the aperture according to that also. So if there's so much light that you can't obviously drop your ISO any lower than 100.
Yeah.
Okay. So take this scenario, your ISO is at 100, your aperture is at 5.6, and your shutter is now blinking at 1/4000th, right?
Right.
It's blinking, it's blinking. What it essentially it's saying, or it's going red, is saying that there's too much, there's still too much light. I can't control it. Right.
Yep.
So this is where now you go to adjust your aperture and start bringing it down to, like f8 or f11 until you get it stopping. So you've got the exposure within the range. So you got a shutter speed that works.
But now you've affected your depth of field.
Yeah, but you're still going to get the picture,
sure,
right?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Enough.
So there are some limitations, but those are kind of the extremes, right?
Yeah,
you know?
In those cases, when there's a bear or whatever on a carcass, you can't dip into your accessory bag like last week we were talking about and pull out your neutral density filters either, right?
Exactly.
There's not enough time for that.
Yeah, just hang on a second.
Yeah,
screw it on. Exactly. Yeah,
exactly.
Drop in the holder.
Yeah, that's right.
No, you're exactly right. So. Now, I know we talked a lot about the wildlife photography here.
Yeah.
But, the same goes with landscape stuff, right?
Yes.
Again, with landscape photography, you're going to use a really low ISO, right? You're going to use 50 or 100, whatever the lowest your camera is going to allow you to do.
Yep.
And you're going to stop down, right? So you're going to use probably one of the smallest apertures, say like f16 or f22, right?
Right. Yep.
But in this case here, shutter speed doesn't matter because you're going to be shooting it off a tripod.
Right. Yep.
Right.
Still in aperture priority mode though.
Still in aperture priority mode. And I shouldn't say the shutter speed doesn't matter. It does, but in a general landscape photo, not really, because it'll balance the exposure properly. And depending on the light, it should give you, a fast enough shutter speed that it'll just control everything, right?
Sure.
Like what I'm saying is, if it's not a super windy day,
I was going to say wind
that
would
sort of
cause some issues with grass if that's in your foreground or something, right? Yeah,
that's right. But in this case here, it will balance the exposure. And I mean, we can get into ND filters, long exposure, blurring, all this kind of stuff, but we're not. But I just wanted to give you the idea that we've got it on both sides of the spectrum, right? Wide open wildlife, stop down, or closed right down for landscape photography.
Sure. And hey, if it's at nighttime, you want to do a landscape and you don't have a tripod and you think, okay, I'm just going to bump the ISO up as far as I can here just to get this much, some light in here. Yeah. We all know that you shouldn't do that because obviously you're going to introduce a lot of grain to the image. Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's going to be another topic for one of the podcasts.
Absolutely.
Is ISO,
yep.
Right? But yeah, you're right there. You don't want to be
careful.
Bumping up the ISO to 6400, to try and handhold a landscape shot because you're lazy and you don't want to take the tripod out, right? So
bring the tripod with you, people.
Really good point. So I hope, everybody has a better understanding of what aperture priority does, but, aperture does affect, different things too, right? Let's go back into the landscape genre for a second. When you're stopped down to f16, f22, okay, you're going to get the starburst effect if you're shooting into the sun.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So those cool effects you see where the sun's just peeking over an edge of a mountain or something like this, right?
Sure. And there's rays of light coming out of the.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Well, what's actually happening there is, the light is actually hitting the aperture blades where they intersect. So that's where you get those starburst effects, right? So
you're not going to get that at f2.8.
No, you won't.
Right.
And so, that's something else to consider when you're doing landscape photos and you're shooting into the sun, right? Just a side note though,
Hmm.
just on the side, when you stop down, okay, when you stop down to the maximum aperture, it's not usually a good idea, and it's because of diffraction.
Okay.
Okay, it's the way the light comes in, hits the aperture blades, and falls onto the sensor. Okay,
Okay.
when people think about f22 or f32, it's going to give me the sharpest image possible.
Right.
It actually softens the image. Okay,
Yeah. It's not
and
as
and
tack
it's
sharp
all,
as other
that's right,
images.
it's
Yeah.
not as tack sharp at say f11 or f16.
Sure.
And that's mainly, and it is because of diffraction. So if that's something you guys wanted to look up on Google and see what it's all about, there's a lot of cool little images or little YouTube videos that actually explain it quite well.
Sure.
But
Yep.
this is where you have to learn where to focus. So you don't need that maximum aperture, right? When you learn where to
Right.
focus properly, f11 sometimes is enough. F16
Sure.
is usually plenty, right?
Yep.
So I just wanted to bring that up to you, starburst, stopping down, and diffraction, because that all has to do with aperture, right?
Sure.
So,
Yeah. And I've heard a lot of people say that, depending on their camera or their lens, it also, it's got, a perfect spot for that camera or for that lens is f8 or f11 or whatever, right?
that's right. That's right.
So,
And that's something you usually test, or you can find these tests online.
mhm.
But yeah, usually the sweet spot is about f8 on any lens, right?
Yeah.
As far as tack sharpness goes in the center of the lens. Yeah.
Sure.
You betcha.
Absolutely.
So I hope, this gives, people a good starting point
Mhm.
to get out of auto, right? And go out and experiment, right? See how depth of field works. Actually, I tell this to all of my students. It's part of a workbook that I have where learning aperture and shooting an aperture priority, set up the camera on a tripod, okay? Shoot down a fence line, okay?
Mm.
Pick a post about a third of the way into the frame, set it at whatever the maximum aperture you have is, like say f4, okay? And then take a photo, go to 4.5, take a photo 5.6, take a photo 6.3,
See what
take
it's
a photo
doing.
f8, and go all the way down to the maximum aperture. And you'll see how depth of field is controlled,
Nice.
right?
That's a great idea.
Gives you a good visual of how aperture or depth of field works with the corresponding numbers.
I think that'd be great, rather than sitting in the middle of the field with the mountains in the distance. Doing that, people would really be able to tell what is happening when they're doing that, when they're making those adjustments.
That's right. Yeah. You can have fence posts, or you can, just go outside and line up a bunch of items, or you can even do it inside your house, line up a bunch of water bottles or something like that.
Yep.
Pick one and just take a photo, right? That sort of thing.
That's a great idea.
But I mean, guys, there's a lot of cool visuals online. If you Google Aperture, it'll show you a bunch of images that'll show you what 2.8 looks like, what f22 looks like, et cetera, et cetera. So,
they're sure. Yeah.
Well, Chris, is there anything you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, not only is this for the beginner, you've been doing this for 30 years, and as an advanced wildlife photographer, you're still using aperture priority, right?
Yeah, you bet. Now, I do and I don't.
Okay.
Okay.
Depends on the situation, right?
Depends on the situation. There's some tricks of the trade that I'll share later in future episodes, shooting in manual and that sort of thing. But I would say aperture priority for the majority of people out there. Absolutely.
Perfect.
So
that's great.
And I still use it. There
you go. Yeah.
And again, like I said, in future episodes, we can expand on using aperture priority, but I don't want to get into other things like exposure comp.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
That goes hand in hand with it.
That's its own podcast on its own, right?
That's its own episode. Exactly. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think we'll wrap it up.
Yep. Sounds good.
I think we covered a lot there. Just want to mention too, guys, I do run workshops. I teach classes. I do seminars. If you want to see see what's coming up, my latest workshop is a shoot till you drop Waterton photography workshop with Monica Deviat. This one here is September 17th to the 20th, and of course Waterton Lakes National Park. And because of the COVID thing, we're actually offering single occupancy. So we don't have to worry about, doubling up into the rooms. So that option's on there. Along with double occupancy, if you're going to come with a spouse or a friend or somebody you're comfortable with, right? Okay, so that's going to be available. So if you want to look for more details on that, just go to my website at joedesjardins.ca and look under workshops.
That's awesome, Joe. And I have been to Joe's workshops before. They're awesome. So make sure you guys take yourself up on that and check it out.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thanks for another great episode, everybody. And if you have any questions about Aperture Priority or anything, if anything we've talked about, you can let us know, right?
Yeah, fire off a message, leave, send us an email, leave a message below, and be sure to check out our YouTube channel.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Okay, we'll catch you next time. Ciao.
You've been listening to the Nature Photo Guys podcast. If you have any questions, contact us at info@thenaturePhotoGuys.ca or message us on Facebook and Instagram at the Nature Photo Guys Podcast. Make sure you listen to all our new episodes on www.thenaturePhotoGuys.ca or visit your major podcast providers, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We'll catch you next time on the Nature Photo Guys Podcast.